Welcome to Signals and Stories, 10 Years with the Vertex Project, a limited series exploring how cyber threat intelligence has evolved over the past decade. In each episode, we break down how analysts actually investigate, covering the data and the decisions that shape real-world intelligence. Stay tuned. Over the past decade, cyber threat intelligence has become faster, broader, and more accessible than ever. We have more data, more telemetry, more automation, and more ways to connect the dots than we could have imagined 10 years ago. But with all that progress comes a new challenge. How do we know what to trust? Is trustworthy intelligence simply intelligence that turns out to be correct? Or is it something more? What's the difference between being accurate and being precise? How should analysts communicate uncertainty? And what makes an intelligence assessment credible enough that someone is willing to make a decision based on it? In this episode of Signals and Stories, we're exploring the foundations of trustworthy intelligence, from evidence and methodology to confidence and analytical rigor. Joining us are Visi Stark, Ryann, thesilence, and Savage for a conversation about why the best intelligence isn't defined by certainty, but by transparency, reproducibility, and the discipline to follow evidence wherever it leads. Stay tuned.
And we're live.
We're not live, though.
Ish.
We kind of are.
Ish.
We're live-ish. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today. I'm so excited that this is a bigger group. It's exciting for me, but I think
we'll have to watch out not to not talk over each other, I think.
Yeah.
Isn't that podcast format? Everybody just talk.
100%.
Anybody familiar with that? It's from 30 Rock, where it's called sports shouting, where it's like everybody's just screaming at the same time.
No, but it sounds like opera.
Yeah.
So I get it.
Except one of those is art. Yeah.
And hint, it's not the opera, or?
No, not according to Timothy Chalamet. All right. Well, I'm taking us down a very different rabbit hole. I love going down rabbit holes.
Probably not the time for me to mention I saw the preview for Dune 3 yesterday. It looked pretty cool.
As to media content review.
Oh, Megan.
Wow.
All right. Well, we are gathered here today to talk about trust and accuracy and precision. And the way that we got here is actually like I had a habit of using precision and accuracy kind of interchangeably, which Visi so kindly explaining to me that we as an organization have had discussions on the differences between precision and accuracy and how trust actually plays into both of those, how trust plays into both of those. And I thought it would be an interesting episode to get Visi to talk about that, and then have the analysts talk about, their perspectives as well. But I think before we begin, it's probably, because I don't want to save it till the end, we want to talk about this. So what? So why are these things important to differentiate between? Is close enough okay? Let's start there. Like, if anybody wants to kick us off with, why is this important to have that distinction?
I mean, I'll kick us off real quick. Essentially, like you mentioned, trustworthiness of reporting and of intel outputs is critical for decision makers to actually make decisions based on those assessments. And so understanding what goes into those assessments becomes super important, or at least trusting that if they did press on it, that there is a viable explanation. So we talk a lot about being able to decompose your assessments and things like that back to ground truth to show why you made an assessment. And that definitely plays into the pairing of, like accuracy and precision, where essentially, to just kind of kick us off, accuracy is essentially how correct you are, and precision is how detailed you are. So essentially, any kind of like intelligence reporting that's expected to be acted on kind of needs both, right? Ultimately, you can't act on an extremely accurate but imprecise assessment. Like, I assess that the sun is going to come up tomorrow. Like, great job, Visi, congratulations, you're 100% correct, and it will be from now until the sun burns out. But without sufficient detail, without sufficient precision, I don't have any kind of context that I can use to make any informed decision or make a call about anything. And so they definitely play into each other and are pretty fluid, but a certain level of both is required for trustworthy intelligence reporting. And at that point, I'll definitely look to others for input. So
I agree. I would say that, you referenced acting on. I think it depends on whether something is actionable or worth acting on, considering what resources you have available. If you don't trust the source, if it's too vague, if you don't know, if it's not helpful information to allow you to either, have a plan for action or justify using the resources to whatever that act would be, then it's not something that you're going to be able to really take into consideration or take seriously or act upon or be able to justify later why you made that decision or why you expended these resources.
I think you hit the nail on the head there too, where essentially without sufficient precision, without sufficient detail, there's just nothing to be done, right? And so essentially that's, you might trust the source, but if the source doesn't give you sufficient detail in order to verify their findings or to validate, their approach to how they made that assessment, you can't act on it.
You kind of ruined my
idea
for what my example of what accurate versus precise is going to be. So Visi had said, is the sun going to rise tomorrow or is the sun going to rise again? But what I was thinking of was if I'm in DC, we have the Capital Weather Gang, and if they tell me, it's going to rain this month, that's not really going to help me that much. And they might totally be correct. It might, rain at some point this month, sometime, I don't know, day or night, what day, how much, do I just bring a rain jacket every day? Do I plan all my events inside and the off chance that's going to monsoon?
This is a great metaphor.
It's not really a good, it doesn't really help me with anything. Like I know, okay, it's going to rain, but I can't really plan. I can't really act upon it. And any of the actions that I would take, like would I justify those resources, whether it's, carrying my, 0.2 pound rain jacket around or changing plans or things like that. Versus if they were more precise, if they said, there's a 50% chance of showers after 6 p.m. tonight. That gives me, they might not be correct. It might not end up happening. It's only a 60% chance, not a 100% chance, but it still gives me much more specific information that I can make a decision on. Like, okay, I might just bring a rain jacket just in case, or I was planning to, have a huge party outside and I don't want to potentially deal with thunder, lightning, or things like that. Maybe it's better to cancel it or move it inside, or just be aware that I should be watching the weather more carefully. If they can give me more specific detail, I can make a better decision. I can justify whatever I decide to do based on.
I love this metaphor too, because taking action to mitigate the risk of rain actually does cost you something, right? It's, you have to carry around an umbrella or carry around an extra jacket and things like that. And so there is that cost benefit trade-off, even though the stakes are pretty low, but the metaphor holds really well.
Good job, MD.
I think the trust piece
Great
is
metaphor.
Go savage.
Sorry.
I'm also trying to picture you having a giant outdoor party. That's
you don't know my life.
Well, some parts of the metaphor are more theoretical than others.
Well, I think the trust piece is particularly interesting because I think this touches on something that we've collectively talked about a lot over the years, is distinguishing good intel from bad intel, and particularly from a market perspective. Like every analyst has opinions about whose reporting is good and reliable and whose reporting is crap, to just be direct about it, right? Yeah. But I feel like the market as a whole has very little capability to distinguish that. Like we've talked about organizations that are willing to pay lots of money for reporting that we would not necessarily consider good or useful, to some degree. But so much of the reporting presents itself as accurate, right? I'm screaming my latest conclusions to compete with every other organization that is screaming their latest conclusions. And frequently that reporting doesn't have the precision to back it up, right? It's just like, this group is doing this to this organization, right, and it's terrible and everybody needs to do something right now. But without that precision, you can't evaluate the risk and the appropriate response, as MB pointed out, but you also can't judge the conclusions themselves.
because everybody's just telling you what's happening and how bad it is and how we all need to pay attention. But frequently that lack of supporting evidence, like why are you making that assertion, is what's missing from those reports.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to touch on the fact that, sorry, Rayne. I think it's also important to touch on the fact that, in a couple of the questions that you laid out and sort of some of the prep material that you gave us, it almost implied, or there was almost the perspective embedded in the questions that trust is sort of binary. You either trust something or you don't. And I think it's important that it's actually an entirely sliding grayscale. And actually, it's even way more complicated than that, because there could be aspects of a certain organization's reporting that you trust and aspects that you don't. And so, like, even within one report, there might be assessments that you deem more trustworthy than others, predicated not only on their ability or their, precision, right? The inclusion of details that allows you to verify it, but also their past performance, right? And I think that, again, Savage kind of hit the nail on the head as well with the fact that 60% chance of it raining after 6 p.m. means that essentially they're not wrong if it doesn't rain. Right? And that's mission critical to include inside of your Intel reporting, and also for consumers in how they handle Intel, is that essentially any of it that is forward leaning, any of it that's predictive, can only do so on a statistical basis. And so that means that sampling it and determining its efficacy and determining its trustworthiness is even more difficult, because you need a larger sample size, because a sample set of 5 or 2 doesn't mean that it's accurate or not.
Rayne, were you going to say something?
Yeah, but only if I can remember what.
Yeah, sorry. I jumped in when there was a pause, and then I saw your lips move, and I was like,
it's
shit.
all good. It's all good. I think it was just something that Jen said, and also Savage, that triggered something that I hadn't really thought about before. I think, Savage, you said something like justify the resources. And then what I immediately jumped to was, you either have to justify the resources or be willing to deal with the consequence. And a lot of times when we're reading reporting, like you said, Jen, we struggle so much trying to figure out, who is this intended for? What is this talking about? Why should I care? And what I'm realizing is, when you're dealing with accuracy and precision both, to me, that's kind of tied to the value, because you really want this to be actionable. You really
100%.
want me to do something. If I look at a report and you're not, calling for me to use some type of resource, whether it's the Cortex to run some queries, you go hunt for something, or deal with this consequence, then why are you writing, right? Why are you here?
That's a great point.
And that's something I just realized listening to MB and Jen.
It's depending on your risk tolerance for something, the cost might be, maybe this was not, what they gave me was not particularly detailed, or maybe it's not a super trustworthy source, or their reporting, even they couched it as a little bit of, this is not high confidence. This is something that might happen, or this could potentially happen. But as an organization, I might decide that the risk for me is too great to either go forward with an action or, not. So it might be, not only about the resources, but my ability to, as Rayne said, handle the consequences of being wrong based on, their reporting and my decision of what to do in response to it.
And in classical intelligence analysis circles, we speak a lot about confidence language, right? Using the language to correctly convey your degree of confidence. And everybody kind of tries to equate those back to percentages, right? If you say likely versus highly likely versus whatever, what should be the percentage bands that those types of things fall in, which does imply then that somehow or another there is analysis happening over time where you can gauge the accuracy of those predictions or the accuracy of those assessments over time. And so one of the questions, Callie, that you mentioned is what makes a trustworthy source? What makes a trustworthy data source? What makes a trustworthy source of intelligence in particular? And I think that's there's a time aspect of it, that it just has to be proven correct over time. And so that's also kind of that incremental process, right? If you regularly produce extremely accurate reporting, but don't provide sufficient detail, and then one day you switch to providing sufficient detail, but you're wrong regularly, that can actually be net negative, right? I think that on the whole, accuracy is more important. If one were to lapse, right, it's accuracy that's probably more important. But without the precision, your assessments, your intelligence just isn't actually valuable. So
that's interesting, because I feel for me, what I like, I agree that that is a factor that would come into play if something is trustworthy or not. But I think it's probably because I work with, Ryann and thesilence so much, but with some of our past projects, like what I tend to look for the most is kind of like the transparency of, I want to understand how they got there.
Show your work.
Yep. And some of that, it might be like, if like very much might be like, their methodology doesn't make sense to me, or like, their justification, they explain it well, but I don't agree. That could be, I might decide that they're less trustworthy based on that. But if it's somebody, even if it's someone who's right the vast majority of the time and they're being fairly precise, I think I would still want to have some kind of peek behind the curtain or some kind of understanding of what they're using or what they're doing.
There's a lot of like math, like old school math classes, like show your work, right? Like coming to the right answer, coming to the correct answer for the wrong reasons is nearly as dangerous as coming to the wrong answer confidently. Yeah. And so essentially that ability, like we speak regularly about the idea of being able to decompose your assessments back into ground truth. And essentially that's that process, right? Is providing sufficient detail for someone to verify your findings, telling the whole story so that they can see all of the things that went into your confidence assessment, or the confidence of your assessment, or your assessment being, truthful generally. So.
Yeah, I actually like that, Savage, because I think the beauty in transparency in the way you described it is I can take what I want. And I think we do that all the time. We read reports and we'll see their final assessment. But when we actually read the detail of it, we say, okay, they got, they went through this path, they saw this activity, they observed this. This is where they went wrong, right? And so we're able to...
Or where they reached, it's often not that they're wrong. It's that it's like a reach, that the confidence that they assess something with is problematic.
Sure. And so we're able to say, you know what, we don't want to take all of this, but maybe we'll take some of this. And I think that can be at times helpful, within itself, because we don't have to necessarily come to the same conclusion, but the goal is to be actionable. So a lot of times we can identify what we can take and pair and marry with our internal telemetry, right? And use and still benefit from. So I think that's the benefit of that precision, that transparency piece as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I feel like that's like the challenge and the conundrum though that's existed within threat intel like forever is that difference between, I want to understand what you're doing so I can act appropriately, which may include, mitigating risk, defending my network, whatever, versus the intelligence side of it, which is there's certain information that I need to keep close hold because it will expose sources and methods. It will tip off the actors to what I'm doing. And I feel like that kind of becomes the crux in some ways of the precision problem. Like we've been advocating for a long time that, there needs to be more precision in public reporting. There needs to be more detail so that we can evaluate.
Show your work, damn it.
Yeah, like we need to evaluate your reporting to some degree. But for all of those reasons that, I just tried to touch on, that's challenging. And it's something that I think as an industry, we really wrestle with. How can we have more confidence in each other's reportings? How can we be sure we're attributing things in similar ways? Like some of the kind of side projects that we've done have sadly highlighted that under the hood, there's a lot of disagreement about which threat groups match to other groups and which activity matches to which and how people are doing attribution, and even differences in how people define words that we throw around all the time like we all mean the same thing. That's not necessarily the case. And transparency, don't even go there. You just, anyway. But yeah, you want to give almost any
CTI analyst immediate PTSD, ask them to like in detail define what a campaign is.
Define what you mean by a campaign. We saw a campaign last week. Well, anyway. But I think that's the thing that we struggled with, right? Like there's another big argument going on about, yet another naming convention that somebody threw out and whether or not that makes any sense or helps or hurts or whether the names even matter, like the whole debate that is sort of endless. But I think part of that frustration is that transparency piece, right? I don't know if my threat group is the same as your threat group unless I have visibility into how you're tracking them and how you're attributing things. But there's a certain part of that we can't exposed. So I'm curious as to what people think about like where that line is, because that's something that as an industry we've struggled with for years.
Well, and you've kind of touched on something as well where like everybody ends up focusing on these naming debates, which are like, I interrupted Rain again. Everybody focuses on all these naming debates, which are sort of the red herring. Like it almost doesn't matter, right? Like realistically, that name containing a cryptonym that means that it's Chinese or whatever isn't that valuable, right? And so like for me, the like opacity or not opacity or whatever of given labels that folks use for threat groups and malware families and stuff like that isn't nearly as important as the precision and accuracy with which they report on it, right? And so essentially we end up all paying all this attention to this shiny object because someone decided to rename something. I'll throw rocks at the recent Microsoft renaming, right? Like somebody decided to rename a threat cluster Spandex Tempest, and that sends everybody off in a tizzy when really what should be the primary concern should be methodological or accuracy and precision.
Yeah, I was just going to say to Jen's question, I think what helps, and we saw this in some of the reports we looked into, I think for PivotCon, where they didn't have to blow up all of their like sources, right? And give all of their, the IOCs that they know or speak to everything so that they can continue. Oh, PivotCon, there you go. Shout out to PivotCon.
Product placement.
Right. But at the beginning of the publications, they would flat out say, hey, this was our telemetry. Like this was our vantage point. We collected this data maybe from honeypots. We used internal telemetry. We supported engagements. They kind of frame where they got their visibility from. So we know this isn't conjecture. You're not just using an intern on the weekends hobby collecting data. You're telling us.
Or worse, just consuming and regurgitating the virus total full file feed, which is like there's a whole cottage industry of intelligence organizations that just consume
the
and
worst
regurgitate
is you
total.
not doing any research, but you're regurgitating reporting from 10 other vendors, right? So you're giving us some insight. And I think that helps, alone if you can provide insight into what your visibility looks like.
Yeah. It goes back to traceability, right? It goes back to providing that thread to ground truth. For sure. What else was on your list, Callie?
I'm just like, y'all have made me redundant because you're answering my questions without.
Well, we read your questions, right before this. So.
I read them a while ago, so I forgot what they were.
I think that's really nice, though, that you read my question.
I just
did.
Listen, I'm not coming in unprepared.
We did the homework.
So that's great. I'm just like, you know what? Like, everybody was so worried about coming in here and like, what do I say? And I'm like, it's actually, it's unfolding the way that I wanted it to. I was like, they're just going to talk and feed off each other. And I'm like, just going to let it happen.
Yeah.
And
Visi gave me the PTSD with the whole campaign thing, but it is shocking to me how, as an industry, with many people coming from, traditional intelligence backgrounds, people can obsess about the exact meaning of confidence terms and just YOLO every other term that the industry
the
uses.
Definition of something as critical as campaign.
Yeah. Or threat cluster or attribution or anyway.
Yeah. Now, I also think there's been a shift. Oh, go ahead.
I would argue that it doesn't also matter necessarily, like if we agree on what a campaign is, if we have the same definition. You just need to know what mine is and I need to know what yours is so that we can, map them together. So I feel like when we're having all of these arguments about it, and I think that also kind of goes a little bit towards the naming schemes. Like I feel like, how does Pride and Prejudice start? It's truth universally acknowledged. You need to have a naming scheme. You need to have like a way to reference the things that you're talking about, but everyone also is just going to hate it regardless, probably also even you.
Right.
Yeah.
And like there is like the methodology aspect that comes into it. Like if I'm building multiple assessments into the naming scheme, or if I'm, my naming scheme is just like too ridiculous to, say in front of a CEO who's been,
Spandex
his company's been wreaked. But otherwise, like, if I refer to all of mine as, root vegetables and Jen is using like a certain kinds of cats. Like it's as long as we know what we're talking about and are able to communicate that to others, like that's just what we need.
Well,
Yeah,
and I think you go ahead.
I would say that's a fair point, right? We don't all have to have the same definition, but you have to know what your own definition is.
Right.
And there's definitely cases where you just need to use a word because it's a word in your language and you need to describe a concept. But there are times where those words need to have a specific meaning. They need to have a precision behind them. And I think a lot of reporting blurs those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of instances, I think the public reporting side ends up blurring those lines. And then also it ends up even worse because people fight about how to deconflict those things, when really, in my opinion, that's an unsolvable, intractable problem that we shouldn't be even attempting to solve, right? We are never going to come to the determination that there is just this one threat cluster named Red Cat that everybody agrees on its boundaries, because everybody has different visibility, everybody has different risk tolerance, everybody has different assessment methodologies. And so I think that we should just, not to like entirely make this a conversation about naming, but it plays into confidence, and essentially having there be a label that you've decided this is our label for this, and here's how we define that label, is the best possible state. I don't think there is a possible state of having any kind of universally deconflicted list of malware families or threat actors and stuff like that, because it's a ridiculous idea, actually. Even just the concept of attempting to normalize all of that into one set of, analytical thresholds that we use and confidence that we use and all like that is completely absurd, right? And so that being something that we spend literally any time and energy on is time and energy wasted that could have been going toward making our methodology better, or more importantly, clearer. So in any case, I'll get off my soapbox, but
this is all about soapboxes, I think, because I'm going to get on another one. Now, I'm wondering if in some ways the whole naming convention debate is almost a false sense of security, right? Like, I'm a SOC analyst, 100%. I'm an Intel analyst. If I can just put a name on this thing so that I can tell, my boss what it is or who it is, then that's fine. So if I can just memorize all the names and cross-reference all the names, then I'm doing my job. And I think, sadly, like, there's a certain segment, well-intentioned segment of the industry that fed into that, because there was this kind of storyline that, we've seen these groups before. So if we, are your managed services provider, or we're your IR provider, and we see these IOCs, our, back-end intelligence store says, well, these IOCs correspond to this group, so we can respond faster because we know how they operate and we know what to look for. There's a little bit of falsity in that, because the old, past performance doesn't equal future returns kind of thing. Like, they're probably going to stick with their habits, but groups also evolve. But if, in theory, and I'm probably like this, this many years in the industry, and I'm still hoping it's getting better, right? In theory, if we've improved detection, if we've improved our instrumentation, if we've improved all of the things that we do to detect and respond and mitigate, it shouldn't matter who it is. We should be able to detect that bad activity and respond to it, regardless of if it's red cat or green tree or, purple platypus or whatever, right? That my job is to defend my network, my assets, and so forth. My job is not to assign a name to the indicators that come across my wire.
Right.
I have a question about that, because on one hand, I agree. And then on the other hand, I understand the need to name. It's kind of like how we have names as people. Right. I mean, I know it refers to.
Well, I think there's also maybe a little distinction between name and label here as well.
Yeah, but
if we were to have a GUID per threat cluster, that'd be fine from an analytical tracking perspective, right? But
it could be. But it's just more so. Even with that GUID, then you have other properties that the naming doesn't matter. You have other properties that let me know what it is, what I think it is historically, because the reason that the name doesn't matter. But I think the set and the attributes associated with that name, the characteristics matter, because as we talk about what resources, and if I want to spend time trying to respond, if I know this is just my 6-year-old son who's playing around, it's like, let him play, right? I can dedicate my time and energy elsewhere. But if I feel like it's someone who can do some real harm, then maybe I want to direct my attention there. So I agree, the name doesn't matter, but knowing
those secondary characteristics. I mean, those are clearly analytically relevant characteristics, right? Like clearly your response and your level of effort, your risk tolerance is all hinge on all of those other secondary properties, right? Other than the label. So I think that there's been this concept that embedding more of those assessments into the label will somehow make it more digestible to executives. But I think it's actually mostly a misnomer because one, the executives aren't going to keep up on what exactly this country versus this country is doing. And two, a given country of origin isn't actually going to dictate, like there are myriad threat clusters from most like large scale apex cyber actors country wise, right? And so that being the case, there are so many differences in their TTPs and in their methodologies and stuff like that, that saying that just knowing that it's from China informs you somehow is actually, in my opinion, like an active red herring and a misnomer.
Well, the whole point about names and executives is really relevant too, because we do use names internally. So, so that when I'm talking to Ryan and MB, if I use a threat cluster name that we use internally, they know what I'm talking about without me having to say, that group that we saw 2 months ago that did the thing with the malware, that they're a shorthand that allows us to speak the same language in a more efficient way. But the executive that I'm reporting to is not part of that group and is not aware of that shorthand. So if I say, well,
right.
Sir, or ma'am, right? Well, ma'am, we've been hacked by Spandex Tempest. That means nothing to them.
That means literally nothing to them. And so it's not actually helpful. Yeah.
MB, I think I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. My interpretation of this is that there's like a little bit of a difference between the use of names where it's just, I need to be able to refer to this as something that I can recognize or I can communicate internally or externally to others. Just having, having a label versus kind of the, not necessarily always like the marketing push, but also like the pressure that an analyst or organizations might have to be like, I have to either link this to something that is recognizable and would be, I guess, like taken more seriously or get more attention from like a sales perspective or from just like a name recognition publicly perspective, or even just internally to be like, oh, like, MB found, Spandex Tempest.
Fancy
That's
bear.
really cool.
Yeah.
Wow, she must be a great analyst. Kind of like justifying your own work versus like MB found GUID 1, 2, 3, 4. That's like less exciting. So I feel like there's some with names, like there's some, I think, pressure also to, even with organizations, that it's not their name that they're using to refer to it, but it's the name that they choose to publish with. It might be linked to the activity, but instead of introducing it as like, this is what we track as, ABC, they'll say like, this is Microsoft's, whatever the name is that's more well known. And I feel like there's also kind of a little bit of that pressure as well, that I wonder how much that bleeds into reporting and then impacts kind of I don't know how I would say it, like the trustworthiness overall, or like the value of the reporting, because you can see that some of it seems much more clearly geared towards marketing.
Really, there's a really important aspect in there too that's kind of buried and is sort of hidden, which is essentially the more things that you need to codify an assessment about in order to publish the name, the more work your analysts are having to do before that cluster can be made public, right? And so like basically you end up with a cost benefit trade-off between accuracy, right, and timeliness. So that essentially, like if you're going to have a threat cluster that just has a semi-opaque identifier, red cat, green tree, you can publish that threat cluster immediately upon discovery and subsequently release updates that refine your perspective or the assessments that you're making about it. But if your assessment actually includes that it's a nation state actor originating from China, or that it's a cybercrime actor originating from Russia, not even to mention the blurred lines between those two and it being outmoded to classify things in binary as binary that way. But essentially you're having to codify more of those assessments and risk being wrong, or codify those assessments and significantly delay your reporting until the reporting is reached, or until that cluster has reached a sufficient volume of activity for you to make that assessment in a confident enough way to be willing to codify it publicly into a name. So effectively, any of those naming conventions that codify assessments, and especially if they codify assessments, multiple assessments, require lots more work before you can publish, or requires you accepting a potential like accuracy hit in being wrong and needing to publicly rename a threat cluster, which, has happened.
I think Visi, I think you just hit on something which is slightly related, but a little different, which is maybe when is it acceptable to be accurate but not precise? And you said something about like timeliness, right? If there's something that's very bad happening and you need to get this information out and you don't have the time to put into this report your methodology and show all the things.
Or to vet the details, like for
it's
being
like,
able to be
but I
disclosed,
need to let
right?
you know that like this IP is doing the thing. And if you trust this, this vendor, maybe through historical reporting, you're like, hey, typically they're on point. That's where
Or
trustworthy.
typically they catch up and subsequently publish their methodology and we agree, right?
Then maybe it's important for you to get that out. Those are the times when I would value, accuracy
100%.
over precision because of the time sensitivity associated with it.
Yeah, definitely.
I agree with that, but it's also where I would want the transparency of them saying, like, we don't know, like, we think that this is happening because of XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
However, we don't know, what time exactly it's going to start raining or like what day exactly it's going to start raining or something like that.
Actually, that brings up an interesting point too.
More.
Like essentially stating upfront the assumptions that you're making or any limitations in your current analytical status, right? And so like these are preliminary results that are being released in pursuit of timely reporting that we definitely will go back and revise is different, like lands differently than somebody just reporting something blindly and then never revisiting it and never refining it.
Yes.
Or
you
just
mean
never even
use good analytical writing, Busy? Like what?
Yeah, right.
I'm just thinking like every time something quote unquote big happens, just like all the hot takes that immediately pop up. And I think that's a sad side effect of our current information environment, right? Who can be fastest and loudest in some cases, not who can
and
be
most confident. Like, I mean, actually, that was one of the things that I was thinking about earlier was essentially like all of the, we can't possibly host a podcast in 2026 without talking about LLMs, can we? Right? Like we can't possibly do that. And so essentially like the LLMs tending toward writing with extremely confident language, even when the assessments are pretty dubious, can be extremely problematic, in particular for intelligence. And like we've discussed like this privately, but essentially for intelligence use cases, LLMs have a lot further to go, have a lot higher challenge than they do for code, which is much more testable, much more concrete, right? And so like the LLMs producing a lot of public intelligence reporting now, at least the prose side of it, means that like the confidence language becomes even more important, and LLMs like by far tend to overstate and state things more confidently than they deserve.
Yeah, I think we've all called out some pretty cringeworthy LLM written public reporting.
Or not LLM written, but it's all like it all depends on people's perspectives. But certainly LLMs tend to produce a volume of output that is highly confident language and often wrong. So
I just kind of jumping in with a quick question, like from a marketing perspective, like from what you all have seen in your careers, like when people put out or like when analysts put out a report, how much of it is changed by the marketing team? Does that impact how precise or accurate reporting is based on what they want to share from their viewpoint? If that makes sense.
It's been a while since I can comment on that directly, and I can't speak to what happens inside another organization between when the analyst writes the report and when it's published publicly. But one of the, inadvertent things that we used to deal with all the time is, we would have someone internally write a report or a blog. It would go to marketing for editing, and they would edit it in such a way that they would inadvertently change critical technical details. So we actually had a couple of people who were basically volunteer technical editors to make sure that didn't happen. But I think we've been talking a lot about reporting and accuracy and precision and language and terminology and naming conventions and whether we should even worry about that. A lot of that comes down to writing and communication skills. And I think that's a critical part of reporting that a lot of organizations overlook. And I don't mean to say that there's just a lot of bad writers out there. That's not what I'm getting at. But what you communicate, how you communicate it, how you choose to communicate that, the phrasing that you use. Are you consciously thinking about who your audience is and what the point of your publication is? Is it
What are you
marketing?
asking them to do?
Yeah, is it a marketing piece? Like Callie said, there's nothing wrong with that, but understand that that's what it is versus what we talked about at the beginning is this is something that I want you to take action on. Have I been clear about that and told you, given you enough information to take action and decide what actions are relevant? All of that comes down to communications, which really tends to get overlooked, I think.
Well, and like the marketing people actually do have a better handle on terminology and things like that for a lot of that stuff, right? Because they've had to deal with like essentially, things like what's the pull through ratio? What's the audience? What's the call to action for this thing? Who's the audience, right? Is something that is kind of first class citizen to someone in the marketing discipline and is a little bit of a second class citizen often in intelligence reporting, right? Shouldn't be.
I mean, I think of the difference between like reading an affidavit that's been specifically designed where like the agent is laying out the evidence and they might say something like on or before X date. And I'm trying to think of like a blog that's been written by a marketing person. I'm trying to think of like a marketing product where they would very much smooth that language out and they would say, like by this date instead of kind of like using all of these different ways to couch exactly what the evidence is. I think that when we talk about communication skills, when we talk about writing, it's so use case dependent on what's appropriate for that use. And I think that in like the intel, like cyber threat intel industry, especially, like there's so much writing or so much reporting that becomes dual purpose. And that's where it gets difficult, where it's not only that they're sharing information about a threat group that they found, but also like the marketing or the sales team is also using it as a marketing product. And that's where those things get quite mixed.
Yeah. I mean, we talked a lot about that for the last workshop where we were going through a lot of different public reporting and we were literally internally having conversations about who's the audience for this. Right. There's an executive summary that seems geared towards like high level people. There's a whole section on malware analysis, which is great. Like somebody did the research and, crossed their I's and dotted their T's the other way. Clearly they did their research. I'm not a malware analyst, so I want the TLDR. I don't want all those details. I do want to know what you've, found about the particular activity or the group that you think is behind it. But we seem to have these reports that are increasingly lengthy, right? This is a 22-minute read for my latest write-up on the activity that I saw. And it's something that in my mind is better geared towards 4 different audiences, right? And we debated internally.
Or at least taking an extremely bottom line upfront approach to the writing as well.
Yeah.
Right?
And we
that
debated
is at least something that we could do, but most organizations tend not to because they want you to read through to get to the conclusion, right? That whole thing.
Yeah. And then we did talk a little bit internally about, well, would it make sense for an organization to publish 4 different pieces geared towards 4 different audiences with different aspects of this reporting? Or is this really just the best that we can expect? Because I don't know what, there's volume pressure, so we just have to get it all out in one piece. But it's challenging as a consumer, to go through all that.
I think that might, like when you're talking about like 4 pieces versus 1 piece, maybe that comes back into like timeliness of how much time do we have to get 4 pieces out for 4 different audiences versus this one.
Shouldn't the LLMs just be able to retarget the output to the different audiences, right?
I mean, you
take a well-written, like fully fledged intelligence report and then just like gear it toward, right?
That's a good use
should be able to, but the real problem is introduction of inaccuracy. Like hallucinations occur at any point in that in that process. So you could certainly end up with the executive summary version of that report actually like reversing things that are in the actual report. So.
The other thing that I do, like this is another pet peeve, right? But the other thing that I do see, and I don't know if this is marketing specifically, is a headline that does not agree with the body of the report. Like headlines that tend to be very precise, like this group did this thing against this industry. And then you get into the, reading the report and it's like, this cluster of activity that we think probably aligns with XYZ group, whatever. Like it's much more squishy when you get
did something
into
against this one target, which like isn't representative of an entire industry, like blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you have to be concise in your title or your headline, and maybe you're trying to grab the attention and get the clicks or whatever. But it bothers me from an analytical perspective because you're saying things that aren't true, and when you get into the details, it's a lot more squishy. But I see that fairly often.
Self-contradictory reporting is on the rise, and I think that's due to LLMs.
But naming things is also hard.
Yeah, definitely.
It is. We say that a lot.
So yeah, like I can see how it, like, for brevity's sake, it's easy to say like this group did X against this group, and that's a shorter, maybe more clickable title than, well, we think this, but maybe that.
Yeah.
Well, also, I think there's also the tendency to overcharacterize something as a trend or as something that's a leading indicator, right? And so I think the silence kind of hit the nail on the head with the example of like food did something against blah industry when really it was one target. And so like, can you say that they're making a concerted effort against that industry predicated on one incident, right? Things like that are like a slippery slope where like they might not be wrong. They just aren't actually providing sufficient evidence to make to like base that claim, and they might not have it too. I think that's the larger conundrum, right? Is if like to Savage's point, if you acknowledge your shortcomings or the perspectives or the things that you can't disclose and state that they are there versus just sort of, blindly reporting something that has no basis or has only, limited basis for believability, it's problematic.
I think it's also just hard to be, concise and have a good section title or overall title that also includes the level of nuance that most analysts would want.
My
to be
favorite Twain
their
quote
findings
ever.
To. So.
I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time.
Well, I recognize
Isn't that a
you
Twain quote?
I think so.
I think so.
Look,
I realize you can't you can't pad your title with all of those qualifying terms that analysts love to use. I get that, but I guess it's I feel bad. I feel like we're kind of canon on marketing, and like Callie's here, and it's not. Callie's awesome, and
I'm sitting.
There's good
with
marketing and there's
Vertex.
bad marketing. It's like
this is all
lawyers.
about all the other companies.
Well, to be fair, like I asked the question, and then we went down the rabbit hole. And as a marketer in this space, I'm also curious about things like that because I want to be helpful to you analysts in producing the best work possible. So it's good to know these things and learn more about it. So I'm not that person that's like, oh, this is like, I've turned this into marketing fluff and now everybody's upset.
Well, and
you
like
don't do that.
the in-speak, the use of in-speak in our industry is also particularly severe and telling, right? So like if you misuse even one in-speak phrase, it's obvious that you're an outsider or obvious that you're not, in the in-group that should be or, has the historical background to do this reporting, right? And so in a lot of instances, that sort of in-speak can get broken by marketing who doesn't realize that it's there. And to the silence's point, technical inaccuracies too, but oftentimes it is just breaking like that in-speak that allows it to convey an innate believability, right? And so like I will trust reporting a lot more that precisely uses the correct terminology. I will just innately trust it more than something that uses imprecise terminology or misuses or, mixes metaphors, for lack of a better term, right? But
I think
That's
also
interesting because I was just
Go
saying.
ahead.
I was going to agree with Visi and just note that I hadn't considered that because I think it's largely subconscious, but it's definitely true. I won't notice it if it's there, but I'll notice it if the language is off.
Yep.
Sorry, Savage.
No,
I'm
it's
a bad person.
I feel like that was a jump. I feel like my interpretation of this conversation is less of like a criticism of marketing and more of just awareness that with analysis and reporting and communicating, it's hard. Like there's a balance that we're trying to strike between being, precise and also being accurate and trustworthy and clearly
and
communicating
brief and timely and
and all of these things. And it's very easy to kind of like miss the mark in some way, especially when there's, competing priorities, or there's multiple audiences that you're trying to get this to, or there's, it's not only the analyst and the analysis team, but there's also marketing is trying to do a corpus it. Like there's just all these different factors. So I feel like it's less an overall criticism and just kind of a recognition that like this is difficult to hit all the requirements in the way that you would like and do that consistently. Like we're all going to mess up at some point. So.
Yeah. And as I was listening to you all talk about it too, I think one of my takeaways from this is also the onus of the recipient, the receiver of the information. So we can criticize, the blog writer, marketing, the analyst, all we want to. But as I read the report, it is then my job now to know all of these things that have now converged that we have to take into consideration. And as I'm consuming this report, assuming I actually read it and I don't just look at the title, I don't just look at the executive summary, and I actually look at the detail.
What's that rule of falling off in reading, right? Like at 10, like the first 10% will get read by 80% of the people, something like that.
Yeah, but I think that's how many people nowadays will just see the title of something shared on social media and share it without reading it, right? I think sometimes with intelligence, you may be quick to want to do that too. Well, not me, but some people may want to be quick to kind of jump on the bandwagon or make sure they're in the know, right? Yeah. And you have to do your due diligence and look at the reporting itself and look at everything that's there. So that's kind of like my takeaway is it's also on us to be accurate in our reading and precise in making sure that we could, vouch for what we're claiming as we try to take action with whatever they want us to do.
Yeah. That balance is particularly difficult, I think, as well, because of the need to assume that anyone outside of the industry that's a consumer of this might need inline explanations for all this terminology and all of this use case and the expectations and actions that are expected of them and stuff like that as well. Because like one of the things that I've definitely seen happen historically is instances where analysts certainly like author it with kind of like another analyst as the default audience, right? Like that's sort of the de facto modus operandi. And so essentially you end up with these pieces that are oriented toward analysts, and sure, another analyst reading it will get it, right? And that makes sense to them. But essentially that shorthand that we use, or assuming that like everybody reads the same under the confidence terminology, like confidence language, that they understand that maps to 40%, not 80, right? And things like that is something that can easily be lost on anyone outside of our industry consuming anything we write. And so like outside of our industry, I'm saying like CTI intelligence analysts in particular, because even InfoSec people aren't analysts, right? Like in a lot of instances, defenders are much more tactically analytical than sort of the more strategic or operational expectations of intelligence analysts. So we occasionally joke about like needing to spoon feed people, or like needing to like, essentially embed that. But like writing for your audience definitely involves taking account of their assumptions and their competing priorities and what all the other disciplines that they've probably had to learn something about that you haven't, that hold space in their head that they can't, reuse that space to, create a pre-cached copy of the definition, according to CTI, the definition of a campaign or a malware family, right?
So it's a tough balance when you're more trustworthy if you use the correct terminology, but then you also have to make sure that
more trustworthy but more boring,
fitting in like a definition of that terminology for the people who are not familiar with it, so they can understand.
That's what hyperlinks are for.
So you're assuming that someone's going to read that length of report and click links in it?
Tooltips, just hover over for the definition. I agree. It's a balance. I think I don't know how many soapboxes have been in this conversation, probably a lot at this point, but one of my other big ones is it doesn't have to be perfect, right? We've talked about a lot of the challenges that we all face as analysts and in the industry, but what I would advocate for is the self-reflection, right? We should always be looking at what we're doing and understanding what we're doing and why, but also giving an eye towards how can we do this better, right? How can we better serve our stakeholders? Yeah. How can we better serve our peers? How can we better serve the industry? It's just that blind, we do it this way because we've always done it this way that drives me a little crazy.
Yeah.
What was it that Whitbit said? That's a sprint name. It was like, we're all trying to just drive the egg forward.
Drive the egg forward?
The egg?
I must
I think
have missed that.
it was like driving the egg forward. And we were like, I don't think that's it. But
I
Close,
will
but no
say
cigar.
too, there are some, I feel like we poop on the industry a lot. I feel like there are some vendors out there who get it right.
Sure.
I do feel like there has been improvement. I just think
I think some have been improving and some have been
interest-
devolving, honestly.
yeah, I think with the money that's here in this industry, you have a lot of people who want to play. You have a lot of new companies forming, right? And some of them are in their infancy. Some of them are trying to show value add. So what they may report on is like, what? But I do think you have some players who have added a lot of value and continue to add a lot of value. And that just goes back to knowing what sources you can trust. Now, that's not a permanent position though, because people change, right? Doors revolve. So just because I trust, I'll say for an example, Palo Alto 1 month, it doesn't mean that in 6 months, they don't have an entire new team of analysts who I may not be familiar with, and you may notice a shift, right? But I think that we do have
or shifting priorities and stuff too, right? Like
Yeah.
we've seen plenty of organizations have their output get better, improve, or get worse as a result of changing priorities and leadership reorgs and
Way to go, Rain. Bring it back to the beginning.
yeah.
Get back
Full
to the whole
circle.
trust. And
You guys did it in an hour. You did the full circle in an hour.
Stay on target.
less than an hour if you cut out the parts that need to get
The banter at the beginning.
Yeah, for sure.
and all the bits you're going to edit out because you're like, oh yeah, we don't need to include that. Or, there they are, like all 5 of them talking over each other again. We'll cut that bit out.
No, absolutely not.
I was going to say, she loves that.
I do.
Did we answer any of your
It makes it
questions?
engaging. It's messy.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we wanted to talk about before we exit today? Any final thoughts? Because you guys you did a really good job just taking all my questions and just answering them without me having to ask them.
These are topics that are near and dear to our heart.
I know. I'm just like, that's why I got you guys together. I'm like, this is going to happen. And I'm like, it's happening the way that I thought it would.
Ultimately, I think it is a process. We have seen some improvements in the space. We have seen some, get worse, right? And I think that the LLM stuff has caused a signal to noise ratio issue that is unprecedented, right? So there are a lot of organizations producing voluminous prose from potentially even small findings where the finding itself might be relevant, but should have been a tweet, right? Versus being an entire full-blown report that like feels like an A. So my only kind of parting thoughts would be to stay focused as analysts on, providing sufficient precision and accuracy to produce the outcomes that we want, and don't pay too much attention to the reorgs and the constant, influx, output reporting and stuff like that. Just kind of try to stay on mission.
Oh, this has been a really fun episode. I'm really glad that you guys have been here today. I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of Signals and Stories. It's part of, if you're just listening now, it's part of our 10-year anniversary podcast series. We're going to have a couple more episodes to reach 10 episodes for 10 years. So if you've enjoyed these conversations, please be sure to check back in. We publish bi-weekly, every other week. That is, if we want to be precise about that. And, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we will catch you in the next episode. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening to Signals and Stories. If you found this episode useful, be sure to follow the series and share it with your team. For more on how the Vertex project approaches intelligence, from data modeling to real investigations, visit vertex.link. We'll see you in the next episode.